In this video, I demonstrate how to set up an independent Wi-Fi network without the internet using one of these simple Wi-Fi access point routers. Now, one question might be, why do you ever want to do that without the internet? Well, there are many situations where you may want to set up a simple wireless network, and especially, for example, if you're doing projects with Raspberry Pis or Arduinos, you may want to network the devices together. Let's say you're doing a robotics project, and those devices do not need to access the internet, but you want them to talk to each other over Wi-Fi. So you can use a hotspot access point like this to network the devices together. Another example might be when you are doing Android development. If you're trying to connect your phone to your laptop and you cannot use the USB cable, you can use ADB, basically the Android debug bridge, using a Wi-Fi bridge instead of a USB bridge. Okay, now before we get into how to set this up, I should probably explain a little bit about the internet connection, which we're not using, but just so people understand how this is different from a standard modem that you would find in your house, for example. So this is a typical all-in-one router and modem that you might find in a house. And I just want to explain what's in here because sometimes it's a little bit confusing. But these devices have several different functions inside. And the first one is a modem. So basically, the RF signal comes in through a particular port or connector. And in the old days, this was a phone line. But nowadays, this can come in through your satellite dish, or it can come in through optic fiber or an RF cable. But generally, there's a RF coax cable that gets connected. And all this does is translate those RF signals into Ethernet packets. So it translates it to data packets, which are then distributed to the devices in your house. Now, the other important function that this has is a router. And that means that it assigns the IP addresses to the network, the local network, and it gives it an address to each individual device. So this main device is the gateway, which has a main global IP address, and the global IP address is the IP address that anybody in the world can use to find you or locate you. But that needs to get translated to a local IP address, which is basically the individual addresses to the devices that are on your local network. So that function is called a router. And in the case of a home, you'll have a device like this that'll do the IP address assignment. But if you're at a company or a school, they will have their own routers, and you don't really have control over that. And now the last function that this has is it has a way of connecting multiple devices together. So if you're just using an Ethernet cable, it uses an Ethernet switch. It used to use something called a hub, but now it uses a switching technology. And this allows you to connect multiple devices using the wired Ethernet ports. And if you're using Wi-Fi, we generally refer to that as a access point Wi-Fi router, and it'll allow you to connect multiple devices with individual separate addresses over the wireless Wi-Fi connection, which can be either 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz, depending on which version of Wi-Fi you have. So all of those devices and functions are in this one box, but you can order from your service provider just a cable modem, for example, that doesn't have all this other stuff, and then you could use other separate devices to do the other functions. Of course, if you're at a school or a university, all you basically have is an Ethernet port coming out of the wall sometimes, and you could use that to set up a separate network in your room, for example, or in your lab. But now, an access point, a Wi-Fi access point router, it's similar. However, it doesn't have the modem part, and it's expecting a live packet, so there's no modem here. Um, and this Ethernet cable is connected to your source of internet at your school or organization or your home. It'll be connected to one of these, and because both of these can function as routers, you generally need to be very careful how you set that up because you don't want them to conflict with each other. So generally, what I do, for example, is I set up my home box here. I just use the modem portion, and I set it up as a pass through. So basically, I don't use the router in the box that's given by the access point company, such as, let's say Verizon or whatever company it is. I control my own router through the access point, and I actually don't use this one. I use a more complicated one, but there's a little nice little simple one that you can use for a project or doing something in the lab. So for this, when you're setting up an independent network, we are not going to use this connection, which is where the internet would go. We're just going to use the Wi-Fi as the bridge by itself. Or if you wanted to, you could use the Ethernet ports if you wanted to plug in things into these Ethernet ports. So the first thing you do to set up the access point router is, if you don't know what the password is, or let's say you found one of these in the trash or something, and you just wanted to use it, as long as it works, the best thing to do first is just to reset it. So most of these access points generally have a reset button, so you can hold that down for 30 seconds or 45 seconds, and then the lights will start blinking, and that basically resets the router, and you can start from scratch. You can see here the lights are blinking on this one, so that means it's in its reset state. So now I could go ahead and try setting it up. So the first thing I do is I plug it into a laptop. If you happen to have one of these old laptops, most old laptops still have an Ethernet connection, so you just plug into that. But on a newer laptop, you will have to buy one of these adapters. So this is basically a USB-C connector, and on the other end it has an RJ45 plug or adapter, which converts it to USB-C. Now I happen to be using Windows XP here, which is an old operating system, but most computers will be the same. Even iOS, you'll find an icon for network, and as you can see here, it detects that something's been connected. So you can see already that this access point gave this a local IP address, and I will double click on this, and that brings up this pop-up window, and I am trying to find out the IP address of this gateway so I can log into it and set it up. So if I click on this tab, you'll see that it tells me the IP address of my computer, of my laptop, is 192.168.1.2, which is very common. But it says the default gateway, which is my access point here, is 192.168.1.1. And that is very common. That's a very typical gateway address. But if you can't use that, another way of doing it is just to open up a command window. You just type command in the run window, and that pops up a command window. You could do the same thing even if it's on a Macintosh or a Linux computer, and you type in ipconfig, and it gives you the same networking information, your IP address as well as your default gateway. So you see it's 192.168.1.1. Now, if you were using a Mac or a Linux computer, instead of ipconfig, the command is ifconfig. So you type ifconfig, then it'll look different, but it'll be the same information. Then you can type exit to exit out of this window. So next thing you do is you open up a browser window and you go to that address. Whatever address the gateway was, that's the address you type into the browser. So it's 192.168.1.1 in this case. Most of the time it'll be that. So once you type that in, it'll open up a web page, and that web page is being served by the device. The information that you see will depend on the model access point that you have. But in this case, it's asking me, do I want to use a wizard or do I want to set it up manually? And I'm saying I want to do it manually. And then it says, configuring the internet requires networking experience. Are you sure? And I say yes. And then it goes to a login window. So very commonly, it will show you a login window, and there will be a place where you can set the password. Sometimes it's just a login, and you need to know the default password, which you can look up the manual. But sometimes it's just admin. So admin's the username, and the password is usually admin as well. But in this case, it's giving me a chance to set my password right here. Okay, so I just logged in with my new password, and it took me to this basic dashboard page. So most access points will have a basic and advanced settings menus. So right now we're just going to walk through the basic menu, and all you really need to start is just setting up your wireless menu. So in the wireless menu, there are three basic things you have to worry about or to set up. The first is the SSID. So basically, that's the name of your network. That's the Wi-Fi name. So if somebody's walking by and scanning for Wi-Fi networks, that's the name that they will see. So you can name this whatever you want. So I set this up as a Fletcher Lab, and the case doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter whether it's uppercase or lowercase. And the next thing is the security. So you generally want to have some kind of password, or you can say none. But I generally recommend adding some kind of password so that your network doesn't get hacked. Now, the older password types was TKIP, and then the newer one is AES. So you can set it up to only use AES. So the WPA2 PSK, that's a pre-shared key. The AES flavor of that is relatively new, and TKIP is a slightly older one. Some older devices only still use TKIP. So if you want to be compatible with older devices, you can click on this one. So it'll use both, or it'll support both TKIP and EAS. And then this last choice here is the WPA for enterprise. That's for companies. That's a little bit more complicated. So I recommend just sticking with one of the first two choices here. And finally, you need to set up your password. Now your password can be whatever you want, but it has to have a certain length, a certain number of characters, and a minimum number of characters. And in this case, the case does matter. So upper and lower case does matter. Now, a minor thing I didn't mention is you can pick a channel. So Wi-Fi uses multiple channels. Usually there's like 11 channels, but you can usually just set it on auto and it'll cycle through the channels automatically. So I just recommend leaving it on auto. And then finally, to save the settings, you click apply. Sometimes this button might be called something else, but in this case, it's called apply. So you just click on that and it'll save all the settings for you. All right, now what I just showed you is all you need to set up the access point, but I will just quickly take a look at the advanced settings just to make a few comments about that. Now in the advanced settings, you have a way to configure your internet port, and this is dependent on how your cable modem is set up. So as I mentioned, this video is about setting up an independent network without the internet. So we will not talk about this, but you can look online for other videos which discuss how to set up your cable modem and configure these. And it's somewhat dependent on the settings of your internet provider. Now, as you can see on these other menus, talk about this particular access point supports both 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. The older Wi-Fi access points only had 2.4 gigahertz or There were other flavors of Wi-Fi, but currently these are the two main Wi-Fi modes that you find. Some of you might remember the old original 80, the IEEE standard 802.11. There was a 5.8 gigahertz one, then the 2.4 gigahertz had G, for example, and now there's a newer N. But these are the current Wi-Fi, the basic Wi-Fi modes, the different protocols that are currently supported. But you generally don't have to worry about any of that. But there's another thing which is handy, which is usually on a security tab. So let's take a look at that. Now, there are many settings that you can configure on an access point. So I will not cover most of them here. The only thing I want to say, there's one important function which I just want to make people aware of, and that is for security, you can either block certain devices from joining, or you can exclusively give access to certain devices. So something that is useful for people to know is that every Ethernet device has an address, and that's called a MAC address. The same goes for the Wi-Fi radio. So if you have a Wi-Fi radio, every Wi-Fi radio, whether it's your cell phone or even like a Raspberry Pi, it has a Wi-Fi chip, and that chip will have a MAC address. So the MAC address is like essentially the serial number of your radio device, or it could be an Ethernet device. So I put a tape here over mine just so I don't want to disclose my serial number. But basically, as you can see here, I just have my computer plugged in. So you only see one device here, and it says it's currently a wired connection. But when I connect over Wi-Fi, it'll show the wireless connections, and you can actually see from this window, from this dashboard, you can see all the devices that are currently connected, what are their IP addresses, and what is their MAC address. So using this information, I can click on this and I can actually knock those devices off of the network. So I can, if someone's connected to my network and I don't want them on, I could exclude them. I can put them on a blacklist, or I could do the opposite. I could say, I only want these two devices, for example, to connect to my network. So if you have a small set of devices, let's say people in your family or phones in your family, and you only want those devices to connect to your network, you can put them on a list. You have to know what their MAC address is, which you can look up in the settings of your device, and you list that MAC address, and it will only let those devices connect. So anybody else who tries to connect to your network will not be allowed. So I just wanted to say that there are ways to configure this so you can either block or give exclusive access to particular MAC addresses. So now going back to the main screen, we're all set. So that is all you need to do the basic setup for your access point. And as you can see here on the dashboard, it's telling me what's my SSID and what's my Wi-Fi password. So now that I set up the Wi-Fi, I don't need an Ethernet cable anymore. I could unplug this, and I could now connect my laptop to the access point just using Wi-Fi. I don't need that Ethernet cable. And now any device that you want to connect, the way we've set it up, all you need to know is the SSID, the network name, and the password. And that's all you need. One thing I forgot to say is that many of the modern access points actually support multiple frequencies. So these, in this case, it's a dual band access point. So it supports both 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. And in the settings, each band, so each frequency, 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz, can be set up with a different password and a different type of security encryption. So I've tried this, and you can actually use them sort of like separate. You could do separate logins for each. So I have here, for example, the 5 gigahertz band is set up with a different type of encryption and password, and the 2.4 gigahertz is set up with a different one. And that will depend on what type of access point you have, but many of the current access points as of 2024 usually operate at 2.4 and 5 gigahertz as well. And as an example, I connected my phone, and if I click over here on attached devices, you can see it'll show me the devices that are currently connected. So you can see it says here wired devices. So I'm currently plugged into the Ethernet. So this is my computer and its MAC address, which I taped over for security. And here is my phone, which I connected here. And it tells you now this is connected over wireless. So and this one's connected. My phone's connected on the 5 gigahertz band. So this is my phone's MAC address and the type of device, and this is the IP address of my phone. So as I mentioned earlier, on these windows, if you click on security, you can look at all the devices that are currently connected, both wired and wirelessly, and you can filter those, either give them exclusive access or you can block them. So I think that's everything. And when you're done, just don't forget to log out, and you can then disconnect your Ethernet cable and start using your hotspot and add devices to it as you wish. And that's the end of setting up a wireless access point network.